any objection, speak now or forever hold your peace on that front. All right, thank you. So welcome everyone again. I am Andy Norman. This is Image Lives. This is a forum for exploring life's big ideas and, if possible, bringing a Darwinian view of life to bear on the task of understanding our topic of interest in greater depth. So today's topic is optimism, cynicism, and realism. And as always, I want us to employ our mosaic, what I've been calling a mosaic approach, which means we want to get lots of short, crisp contributions and arrange them in really interesting new ways. So one of our things we try to do here is be brief so that we get lots of turn taking and lots of people get a chance to be heard. If you have an interest in speaking, I hope you will raise your hand using the reactions button at the bottom of your screen. That will let me know that you'd like a turn. And when your turn comes, keep an eye on whether other people are also raising their hands, because if there's many others feeling a need to speak, that's your cue to share the floor with them. All right. Okay. So for many, realism and optimism seem inversely correlated. That we have to choose one or the other because we can't have both. And there's some kind of basic considerations, or you might think of these as data points that might incline you to accept this inverse correlation. For one thing, when I devote an hour to reading the newspaper in the morning, I end up feeling kind of down about it. I'm sure many of you have had a similar experience. It seems plausible that many people find it necessary to engage in faith-based believing because it gives them hope or optimism, and I think many people of faith think that being overly realistic or overly skeptical in your outlook is actually kind of depressing. And there's now increasing evidence that indulgence in faith-based believing tends to make your worldview less realistic. We sometimes use the phrase cold, hard reality, as though reality was inherently cold and difficult and depressing. Cynical portrayals of human nature are often celebrated for their realism, a point argued beautifully in Rutger Bregman's recent book, Humankind, A Hopeful History. And of course, we often think little of those who portray reality in hopeful, uplifting ways by kind of brushing them off as seeing the world through rose-colored glasses. And in all of these ways, I think we tend to reinforce this idea that realism and optimism are inversely correlated. So the question I want to raise to all of you is whether these things are really invariably at odds, or does having more of the one necessarily meaning having less of the other, or can we find ways to combine them both? And I got to tell you, my go-to thinker on this particular topic is my friend Bob Fa, who's here again at my request. Some of you may remember he joined us a few months ago. Bob is a person I admire enormously, in part because he combines realism and optimism in ways that continually inspire me. And so I'm going to invite him to kick off the discussion by sharing a few thoughts of his on this topic. And then I hope we can open the floor and have some fun. So Bob.
Thank you, and I appreciate this. To me, I think if you want to, I want to have a purpose-driven life, not the religious book, Purpose-Driven Life, but in the sense that I'm living for a reason, and I see myself as a humanist who cares about people, humanity, and myself. And so my ultimate goal is sustainable flourishing for the world, for humanity, for myself. And, as you said, Andy, for me, I think we have choices. We have the limbic system, which wants us to focus exclusively on negatives. We've got a prefrontal cortex, which allows us to focus on other things. And one of the key things is that our brain, we have over 180 different cognitive biases that neuroscientists have discovered and described. One of them is called the negativity bias, which is a very understandable, great survival mechanism for scanning our environment constantly for potential threats. And so it's good, it keeps us alive. And really from you're talking about sort of a Darwinian evolution. I like to think of it as sort of evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology. We're influenced by that. So that slight paranoia makes us more likely to survive. Because if we see threats, even where they're not, we're much more likely to jump and be safe when there is a threat. And so that, makes a ton of sense. And it also skews our view of the world. So a lot of times when I hear people say they're being realistic, I hear them just essentially, just listening to the negativity bias and listening to a bunch of negative things. If you're truly realistic, can you also tell me about the thousands of cooperations that it took for you to achieve what you just did today? That's realistic. Pretending they don't exist and that only things that bother you exist is actually negative fantasy, just as much as the other way around for the believers who think everything happens because some higher power wants it to happen for them. So one of the things I teach a lot is about choosing to rebalance your negativity bias based to a certain degree on what you want to accomplish in your life. Because I want to flourish. I'm going to face life as it is. That's in my view, finite, it's done when it's done. But then also say, and I'm also, because of that, I'm here for a short period of time. I might as well enjoy as much of it as I possibly can while being realistic and making a difference. So I'm going to focus on beauty to a high degree, never to the exclusion of looking at the hard truths. It's a yes and. Face our truths, then bring a lot of that, the beauty in my life, and love for people, caring for people, looking for the wisdom, even in people who I disagree with on many points. And all that seems to make a big difference. So that's my gist right there. And hopefully that was a good kickoff.
Bob, thank you so much. I'm so glad we captured that on video, because next time I start having a bad day, I'm just going to tune into that particular riff by Bob, and it's going to cheer me right up. And I recommend that as a form of therapy to everyone. Jeremy,
I think for us to consider. I mean, I've always liked and quoted Antonio Gramsci, the Marxist Italian theorist who, when in prison, wrote notebooks, and his famous phrase, optimism of the will, pessimism of the. I think the reason I wanted to mention that is because it contains this kind of dichotomy. And of course, I absolutely agree with what Bob said. And another way of saying it is that if you test our taste system, we are something like 1,000 times more sensitive to negative tastes, to bitterness, than we are to sweetness, for the obvious reason that Bob gave, that if you eat poison, you're dead, whereas if you miss out on a bit of honey, you can always get some tomorrow. And the third point is really a more personal one, which is as a psychiatrist, psychotherapist, doctor, I've always seen my job as holding on to the hope, even if one's faced with suicidal depression or intractable psychosis, or in the physical world of physical medicine, terminal illness. There's always hope. And I think that fits in with the Gramsci quote, in that I think there's a kind of democratic aspect to this. And that's to say that the reason why the doctor or the psychiatrist or the politician, dare I say it, has to hold on to hope is because we are a social species. And if there's a kind of a world of negativity, then that has to be balanced to use Bob's phrase. So I think the balance doesn't just occur sort of internally and, as it were, neuropsychiatrically. It also occurs in the interpersonal field. So that's my little contribution.
I love it, Jeremy. Thank you. Velikovsky, please pick up on that.
Thanks. I just thought I'd throw out a question. I don't know the answer, but I wonder to what extent either optimism, cynicism, or realism is a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if you have the attitude, I'm going to be optimistic, great things are going to happen, or vice versa, a negative sort of approach, thinking nothing good ever happens, just how much that happens. I'm no great fan of The Secret or anything like that. I think there's a lot of cognitive kind of tricks and biases going on there, but so that's just a question, is how much it affects us. The other comment I was going to make was regarding Bregman, which you mentioned earlier, Andy. I saw a great YouTube interview with Yuval Harari and Rutger Bregman. I'll throw the link in the chat. In a nutshell, they were kind of trying to get them to play off each other and have a disagreement to make the interview a bit more interesting and contested. And so Bregman was saying, I'm kind of the optimistic guy, saying human nature is good. And if we think that way, it'll become a self-fulfilling prophecy because it can change the way you vote. Whereas Harari is kind of seen as more of so he's a bottom-up guy telling a story that we're better and should be optimistic about how good we are and can be. Whereas Harari's a bit more top-down, saying this is how history has been, not a very pretty picture. Here's some directions we should maybe try and head in, from more passing laws and, maybe making it illegal to farm animals, etc., with a slightly more cynical or realistic approach. So it's sort of an interesting sort of playoff between those two, I think.
That's terrific, and thanks for sharing the link. That sounds fascinating. Hank, join us.
Hi all, pleasure to see you all again. So let's see, I'm going to try to keep it simple again. Evolutionary psychology and the function of denial. And if we think about in the most basic way, how are we cave people, or how are we going to get out of our hut when we've got all kinds of creatures and all kinds of people and all kinds of elements that endanger us? So at some level, the survival mechanism says something like, it ain't so bad. So we get out of the cave, we get food, we provide shelter, we make friends. So there's a basic function in the evolutionary psychology of denial, and then it can go awry, but the denial could be one of the bases for optimism.
Yeah, well, it's easy to imagine that when a mindset that, life sucks and then you die becomes so prevalent that you can't even, forage for food, that would be a highly maladaptive tendency of mind, right? I think, Steve, you've been waiting the longest.
I think pessimism is getting a little bit of a bad rap here. My favorite definition of pessimism is that a pessimist is just a fellow who looks both ways before crossing a one-way street. I'm rereading Haidt's book, Righteous Minds. And as I was reading some of that yesterday, I was wondering if there's an analogy we could draw between Haidt's idea of moral sort of taste receptors and pessimism and optimism, both being essentially different tastes that people have to different degrees. And because that book is about politics, another question I'd like to toss out for the group, and maybe there's research on this, I don't know, but I wonder if progressives and liberals and Democrats in the US are more prone to optimism and Republicans have a darker view of human nature and are more prone to pessimism and cynicism.
Interesting. I love the way several people already have raised interesting questions that are enriching our sense of how many different things here are worth exploring. Kathleen, can you pick up on one of them, perhaps?
Yeah, what I'm hearing a lot is that optimism and pessimism might depend on what is true or what might happen. And I've been reading a lot of Irving Yalom because I turned 60 this year. And optimism and pessimism don't have to be about how bad we are or what the truth is, but if we are pro-social, our value can be, how can I best model humanity in the face of this terrible whatever it is? So if it turns out we're really horribly selfish people, how can I best model for other people, for children, for my students, what it is to live with that knowledge? And that doesn't have to do with what's going to happen or not, or what's true or not. It has to do with how we choose to live.
Mhm.
And when we do that, maybe we can influence people. Like the other day when car was beeping at me and I was thinking, well, that's either somebody I know saying hi, or somebody is mad that I'm not going fast enough.
Mm.
When they passed me, I waved and like as if they were somebody I know. And I saw the driver like a smile come on his, he was suddenly wanting to be that nice person waving.
You might have turned his day around by giving him a different way of thinking about his own attitude. Very, very cool. I think a couple of you now, I wonder if the distinction between hope and expectation is useful here. So Jeremy, I think, talked about what optimism of the will and pessimism of the intellect. I'm inclined to gloss that in the following way. Indulging in willful hoping is permissible, but indulging in wishful believing or willful believing is not, because that's almost willful dishonesty. Maybe our expectations should be reality-based, but our hopes can swing free of reality to some degree. Or maybe our hopes have more to do with what can be than with what is. Some of you have done a nice thing by lowering your hand after having raised it, and that helps me keep track of who is still waiting for a turn. So Alex.
I think when we talk about happiness and sort of like religion or beliefs, we're skipping some steps in between. I think in between there are some joints like meaning and purpose that there are multiple ways to get to, and that all lead towards happiness, and that happiness helps you look at things through optimism. I think you can get to meaning through religion, and that's the short way. That's the easy path, and it disrupts a bunch of other things. But you can also get to meaning through logic and through finding purposes and finding what we can call truths, what we can call objectiveness, like objectivity. I think through objectivity, you can also get to the same place religion gets you without messing up all of these other chains in your life by believing something without reason.
Thank you, Alex. Really interesting. Diane.
Yes, listening to all the various comments, I'm trying to hear where these things are placed. Is it in the individual? Is it really a matter of choice? Well, that's a bit of a different question. Is it a personality problem? That is, some people are pessimistic, some people are optimistic, some people are realistic. I think somebody mentioned that people who are somewhat depressed tend to be more realistic in their expectations, because the average person is more optimistic than the actual situation warrants. But then how much of this is a function of a situation, and how much of it is also a function of the other individuals or individual that one is interacting with, so that, you know, is there social influence, or is it entirely up to the individual mind?
Very nice. I'm sorry, did I cut you off?
No, that's fine.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you, Diane. That's lovely. Hank, I'm guessing you have something else to add.
Yeah, and Diane just brought up the individual and, let's say, the group or the culture. But much of the research suggests that in terms of genetics or temperament, that it's like people who are couch potatoes. There's some research on people who are couch potatoes. They just don't need to do much activity. And there are people who cannot help but do much activity. And if we leave out the cultural component, there's some kind of temperamental piece that we come in with. The same thing, the research on, let's call it optimism versus a negative point of view, that some people have that genetically, and what the culture or the family system does to that is another story. But you know, you don't usually get a group of people together. Well, I'll leave that alone. But just to keep that in mind, that then what the culture does with these people, if you join a cult group and you're sort of a temperamentally born optimist, you're going to eat that stuff up.
Yeah.
Or if you're a pessimist, they'll kick you out, or a questioner. Yeah.
Does anyone know if optimism, pessimism is one of the sort of the big personality dimensions? Don't psychologists? Steve's shaking his head, so it's not. I guess they say what introversion, extroversion is one of them, but I guess optimism, pessimism is not. Okay, Bob.
It's associated with extroversion.
Yeah.
Hopefulness is associated with extroversion.
Yes.
Yeah.
And is pessimism associated with introversion?
Not very strongly. I mean, it's not a very strong relationship, but there is a facet of extroversion that is associated with optimism.
Interesting. Thank you. Bob.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things is to think of these as tools. They're mental tools in the sense that, so positive psychology has done a bunch of interesting research on optimism, but they also have looked at pessimism. And one of the things that I'm struggling to make sure I'm remembering this correctly, but was that if you're trying to do financial analysis, pessimism, the slight pessimistic slant is going to make you more efficacious. If you're about to go start a new business, optimism is going to be more effective, but you need a balance, of course, of both to do anything. I do a lot of public speaking, and when I'm designing, I bring on more of a pessimistic stance. What could go wrong? How might people be upset with this? Then I design, and then when I'm about to get up on stage and speak, I go into much more optimistic mode, which is all about connection with people, strong confidence that there's going to be a positive outcome here. And so I'm exclusively focused on delivering something instead of preventing something.
So maybe the ideal approach is to be very situational about your positivity and your negativity. So even more than a financial analyst, maybe an auditor who's looking for fraud, right? I mean, if you go through your entire life looking for fraud, you'll find evidence of it everywhere and end up probably depressed as hell. But if you put on your fraud detector hat for certain purposes, helps you do a good job as a IRS auditor maybe, but then you take the hat off, you go home and you enjoy laughing with your kids, right? Fascinating. I'm going to pick up on one word that Bob mentioned there. Maybe we should be thinking of these attitudes as tools to one or another degree. That reminds me, I think Kathleen, used the expression, how to best model the world. Think about the word best there. There are at least a couple of different things we might mean by a best model. It might be most accurate, or it might be most useful, or it might be most conducive to human flourishing, right? And it's easy to imagine ways in which models achieve more of one of those virtues at the expense of one of the others. And perhaps that's why these things are always in tension, even if it's not a zero-sum tension that can't be, in all cases. Steve.
Well, I was just going to say that I think either excessive optimism or excessive pessimism would be dysfunctional. You use the word balance and degree, and I think that's fairly critical. One way in which a mild to moderate degree of pessimism can be functional is to protect you from crushing disappointment. If your optimistic expectations are unrealistically high. And I think a case in point for me, and maybe for all of us, was what our expectations were about when a COVID vaccine was going to happen. I was vaccinated in January. I was certainly not expecting back when the pandemic began that I would be vaccinated in January 2021. And so if I had had expectations that, I'll be vaccinated by Halloween, I would have been actually more depressed than having a slightly pessimistic attitude about it.
Nice. Thank you, Steve. Incidentally, I know Joe's waiting to speak, and I'm going to get to him in a second here. I'd love to hear from some of those who have not yet spoken. So I hope you take that encouragement under advisement. I'm also seeing that Simon is using the thumbs up widget in perhaps to get
find the hands one, Andy. I'm sorry, I don't know why mine doesn't have a hand.
Okay. You are raising your
question. I mean, what's the evidence that pessimism and optimism are actual maladaptions right now? Because obviously they must have been created in our evolutionary adaptive environment, and so have we got evidence that they are maladaptions, or are we just saying they are?
Yeah. Well, there certainly seems to be a degree of pessimism or a kind of pessimism that becomes dysfunctional, that makes it hard to thrive, and perhaps even hard for our ancestors to have thrived. So and I think in the quote I included in the announcement for this, I mentioned a quote from Charles Sanders Peirce, the great 19th, early 20th century pragmatist philosopher, who basically said, it's likely that the ancestors whose heads were filled with pleasing and encouraging delusions might have had a survival advantage over those who were too logical for their own good about it, at least on certain subjects. I'm sure that's not the final word on the subject, but Velikovsky.
Thanks. Just with what we were saying about modeling the world, and is the view adaptive? And I was thinking about what Steve said regarding COVID. Can the brain's trust here tell me this? Is this view, this is a proverb or an aphorism that I often find myself returning to. Can the brain's trust tell me, is this optimistic, pessimistic, or realistic of me to think this way? The aphorism is, definitely not everything happens for the best, but for every bad thing that happens, there's something good can come out of it.
I'm going to pick up on that briefly. It does seem to me that the space of the possible is dependent on the actual. So the range of possible futures is a function of the conditions in the present. And so to maintain an accurate worldview, we need to continually update our mental models for accuracy. And when that also shapes our sense of what's possible, it can begin to affect our mood, and sometimes in very negative ways, right? But we can always choose to be rigorously evidence-based in our understanding of what is, and resolutely positive about what we can make out of the reality that has unfolded to date. In other words, we can always choose to focus on the best of all possible future worlds and set our hopes on those, even while our expectations are modulated by the facts. Wow, 4 or 5 people just jumped in. I must have touched a nerve with that one. Rob.
Yeah, I caught a little bit of a discussion on NPR the other day between 2 people who were apparently investigating the mind-body connection and the roles of emotion and things. And what came up for the person conducting the interview was he felt that the primary emotion to derive human behavior was awe. And I was really struck by that. It seemed to me that if you can get yourself out into a place where you can feel a sense of awe about the universe or nature or, my library, you change your whole biochemistry, your whole attitude and so on. So I wanted to throw that in because I'm trying to figure out how we can change the emotional temperature of the planet.
Very nice.
Which is a big challenge, but I think vital.
So here's a possible prescription, right? Maybe if we each carved out a little time every day to experience awe or wonder, one of those types of emotions, maybe we'd systematically begin to take a more positive and constructive outlook on things. I love the suggestion. Bob's shaking his head very decisively there, which suggests to me that he's actually has some real evidence that might actually be true. Randy.
Hi, everyone. I'm unfamiliar with this group, but it's all a very interesting discussion. And for those of you who don't know me, my whole field has been developing evolutionary psychiatry. And the center of that is trying to figure out why emotions exist at all. So I was especially interested in the comments from people about, the only reason emotions exist is because we're in different situations. And so our emotions are either useful or useless, depending on whether we are in the situation in which it's useful. My most recent work is trying to figure out why the vast majority of bad feelings are in fact normal, but useless. That is, the brain mechanisms are normal, but they're useless because they go off at the wrong time or at like. One reason is the smoke detector principle, which people have mentioned already. That is, the cost of the bad feeling is small compared with not having the bad feeling if something awful might happen. But also, another factor is that we're in environments that are vastly different from where these emotions evolved. And the worst one of all is that the emotions evolved to get us to maximize reproduction and fitness, not for our good or the group's good or anything else. I find that a very depressing idea, but one that I think does have solutions in the evolutionary origins of why we are so pro-social.
I love that contribution to our discussion, Randy. Thank you. Jeremy, coming to you in a minute. Let's hear from Diane.
Yes, actually, listening to this whole business about optimism and pessimism, it seems that we're moving towards emotion, because one of the things I wanted to ask is, to what extent are they emotions or emotional? And I read something very interesting a few months ago, suggesting that emotions are, to Randy's point, a kind of sense that they give us information about the potentials of the situation that we're in. Is it going to be for our benefit? Is it going to harm us? Is it taking something away from us, et cetera, et cetera? And I find that a useful way of thinking about it. And it could be that optimism and pessimism and realism are actually part of that general sense.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you, Diane. Jeremy, is this a good time to invite you back in? I think you may need to unmute.
I want to go back to awe and to actually what Alex said much earlier, but I have to first just acknowledge that I am in awe of Randy and his work, which has always been a touchstone for me. I think there are several conversations going on here. One is sort of to try and understand what are these phenomena that we call optimism and pessimism, and are they emotions? But there's also another sort of subtext, which is how should we lead our lives? Should we lead our lives optimistically, realistically, or pessimistically? So I think those two sort of conversations are getting somewhat, possibly even at odds with one another. I wanted to just bring in Darwin, because I think there's another subtext to this discussion. It was implicit in a way in the introduction, which is religion a kind of unrealistic optimism, and how does an evolutionary psychologist, an evolutionary adhering individual live without that kind of fake optimism? And I think that was slightly implied in the introduction. Darwin is a very interesting case, and I think he kind of validates what Alex was saying, because of course Darwin was fundamentally an optimistic person, I think, and yet he had a most appalling tragedy, the death of his the daughter to whom he was absolutely devoted. And in a way, I think, and his wife dealt with this, Emma Darwin dealt with this by through religion. Darwin definitely became agnostic or atheistic, but I think that he found meaning in life in the everyday, in his incredible observational powers. And so, in a sense, he maintained a kind of optimistic worldview simply by his adherence to reality. The reason I bring that in is because this doesn't help us understand what optimism and pessimism are, but I think it sort of does address the kind of how should we lead our lives aspect to this discussion.
Yeah, and it's easy for me to imagine the mechanism by which becoming a close observer might spare you from the worst ravages of sort of reality-based despair, right? If you get outside, a lot of the worst forms of despair often involve your own mind as an echo chamber, kind of amplifying the negativity. If you can just get out of your own head and really observe stuff that's outside your head, it can probably break that cycle and allow you to be both more realistic and simultaneously more optimistic. I'm going to shut up now, David.
Yeah, I just wanted to tether this a little bit with one, I think, pretty clear example from evolutionary medicine that might help us get a grip on the idea of depression being adaptive. And that's a little bit from my area with sleep and the evolution of sleep in humans. So seasonal affective disorder is on the almost an order of magnitude more likely in places in the world where there's a lot of seasonality and there's a lot of differences in light and dark throughout the seasons. This is essentially a depressive state. And this has been argued to be an adaptive state in environments where it's cold and dark outside. It doesn't really pay to go out searching for calories when there aren't any. And so seasonal affective disorder from this evolutionary medicine perspective might have been an adaptive mechanism to depress our activity when it was not very beneficial or didn't pay to go out and spend all that energy, and then to boost it and ramp it up again when it was time to get out and it was sunny outside again, and we had all those zeitgebers telling us to go find calories.
Fascinating. Utterly fascinating. Wow, wonderful. Randy, would you like to get a second turn here?
You know, that's a very interesting idea, and I'm so glad someone's still pursuing that. I actually took all the data from an Institute of Social Research project we did one time to look at whether there might be genetic differences between individuals who evolved in northern climates versus equatorial ones. And indeed, there was more tendency to seasonal affective disorder. Someone else needs to do that right, though. It would be very interesting.
Yeah, Charlie and I cited you in the paper that we talked about this very topic.
All right. Very cool. Is that Hank? You ready to jump back in?
Yeah, back to the topic of attitude and optimism. I thought I would just, I think Bob talked about tools a lot today. So I thought of some of the Buddhist notions of, let's just say, clinging and non-attachment, and the whole notion about balance. So if we talk about, if you don't cling to pessimism, or no, if you're mindful that you can be pessimistic, or if you're mindful that you can be optimistic, you may not want to push one or the other on to yourself as you self-talk, even unconsciously or non-consciously. It's sort of, okay. So that'd be one piece. And I remember studying with a Swami, you know, he had some pleasant things to say. He would translate some of yoga philosophy and Buddhism. And in terms about non-attachment or detachment, he'd say, if you don't want any disappointments, don't make appointments. Okay. So if you don't go too literal on it, we're talking about he's trying to translate to the average Joe and Jane about clinging.
Yes.
And so in my practice as a psychotherapist, I pay a lot of attention to, and in groups, but I'm not sure about politics and your whole notion of cognitive immunity. That might be a useful tool, the way Bob talks about the whole notion of clinging. And I'm not sure from the researchers here, how many people have done much research about that whole notion. I know they do about mindfulness and detachment. So just another piece of a tool to keep in mind.
I love that. And of course, the Stoic philosophers from the Western tradition that I'm more familiar with than Buddhism might have actually got their notion of non-attachment probably from the Buddhists in the East historically. But one of the ways in which the Stoics expressed a similar view was that our happiness levels are more a function of the discrepancy between our expectations and outcomes than it is just the absolute value of the outcomes themselves. So whenever there is a discrepancy between expectation and outcome, you always have two choices. You can redouble your efforts to achieve your expected outcome, or you can just lower your expectations. And sometimes lowering your expectations or moderating them in such a way to make them more realistic is a good way to keep yourself on your mood on an even keel.
But Andy, here, based on what I've studied and what other people are saying, it needs to become a secondary process. It needs to be a non-conscious process. It's not something that becomes mental or cognitive or prescribing a tool. It's like prescribing a tool is kind of bringing, going fishing and bring somebody to the fish rather than teaching you how to fish, and then it becoming part of your, what's in the Feldman Barrett talks about body budget.
Okay.
Sort of creating this part of your body budget that's non-conscious that
Interesting.
we know it exists. So another.
Yeah. Thank you, Hank. I think Cormac was trying to get my attention. Cormac, what do you have?
It's just listening to what David was saying about the evolutionary background to seasonally adjusted disorder. And I'm rereading Down and Out in Paris and London by Orwell at the moment. And one of the things that he talks really well about is when he first falls into poverty, how concern for the future disappears. And it struck me how that might be a lot of I don't want to say depression because it's minimizing it, and it's much more than that. But that concern for the future is something, if you don't have that anymore, you might be sad, you might be hungry. And he talks a lot about hunger, but he says this lifts, you don't have to have concern for the future, it disappears as a concern. And when I heard David speak, I wonder, is there kind of an evolutionary value to that as well, that once you get to a certain level of poverty and lack of resource, that there's some sort of switch in terms of how you think about things? I don't know. I just wonder, has anybody researched it or looked at it?
Fascinating. And Randy is.
So I'd be especially interested to what members of this group think about why it is that we feel pessimistic when things aren't going well. It seems obvious, right? Your marriage is not going well, or your job's not going well, let's be pessimistic. And my foraging theories about this have been used. But I keep saying, well, hey, if the marriage is really ending, why not just feel great about yourself and go out and be positive? Or if your job isn't good, why not feel positive? The only answer I've been able to come up with is that maybe it's not good for us to jump out of big endeavors too quickly when they're not going well. It's better for natural selection to have shaped a mechanism to prevent us from being optimistic about our own futures, to keep us in that situation so we don't jump out too soon. That's just one idea. I'm very curious what other people might think.
Wonderful question. Alex, I'm going to call you next. You don't have to answer the last question, but of course you're welcome to as well.
I am answering the last question to a certain extent. I think to a certain extent, pessimism is an exaggerated version of realism. So maybe part of the reason that when something goes wrong, you don't jump to the next thing immediately is because realistically, you exaggerate the last thing you. I don't think I'm putting this very cleanly, so I'm gonna think and pause for a bit.
Well, I think you're onto something there, Alex. There's something called recency bias, which is recent disappointments weigh heavily in our minds and in our thinking, and recent successes do as well. And sometimes they actually color our outlook in unjustified ways. So cognitive psychologists call this a bias precisely because we attach sometimes too much weight to the recent and forget that it's just one more data point in a long string of data points. So I don't know if that's exactly the point you were trying to make, but I think
that's the general area I was trying to lead.
Yeah, nice observation. I like it. Jeremy. Do need to unmute again, Jeremy.
Just an example of the recency bias that annoys us in the UK is the fact that our Prime Minister, great friend of Donald Trump, made an absolute mess of his COVID response for the first 9 months. But now the vaccination program is going extremely well. Everyone's forgotten and forgiven. I wanted to go back to Randy's point. Why is it? He asked a question to which he sort of says there's no one's given him a satisfactory answer, but this is a question I would throw back to him, which is, surely evolution is always a question of trade-offs. And that's why I'm sorry, I'm just repeating myself, but that's why I find the Gramsci sort of approach so helpful, both sort of intellectually and I think also sort of morally. In other words, you've got to be able to hold on both to pessimism and optimism. You've got to both, as it were, say, well, my job's not going very well at the moment and things are pretty awful. And yet at the same time, perhaps they'll get better, etc. So I think evolution doesn't create a kind of perfect world, a perfectly adapted world at all. We're always in this kind of trade-off state. And that kind of accounts for the discussion we're having now, I suspect.
I wonder if this connects a few of the dots that have just been thrown out. Practitioners of mindfulness meditation will often say, live in the moment, be here now. And I think that means something like, don't just dwell in your hopes about the future or your grievances about the past, but just let yourself immerse yourself in the moment and maybe observe the present more closely in the same way that Darwin, right, was extremely good at. And if Darwin's close habit of observation allowed him to combine optimism and realism in a powerful combination, then maybe there's something deeply beneficial about this Buddhist admonition to live in the now. We need to spend less time getting hung up in the echo chambers of our minds, more time getting outside of our minds and being in the present, so to speak. And maybe that could allow us all to maintain optimism without having to compromise our realism. So we have time for a couple more comments, and then I'm going to conduct the vote for our next month's topic. Hank and then Randy.
Yeah, I'd like to just get back to another set of basics from evolutionary biology, and primarily, and that is the safety and danger detection aspect of the primitive brain, all the way back to the bacteria. And then I've read some material about it, but the whole notion of how that is another sort of forms a basis for, let's call it cynicism, or I'd rather say critical thinking versus optimism, which is putting a rosy glow on something without too much critical thinking, but the whole evolutionary biology of that. And I imagine a number of people here have looked into it, but I just wanted to raise it again.
Thank you for that. Randy, your hand is now down. Does that mean?
I accidentally left it up. I'd rather hear from other people. Thanks.
Okay. Well, we have time for a last word. Would anybody like to take it? Yeah, Alan.
Well, thank you to everyone. It's been fascinating. When I'm talking to children, which I do quite a bit, I try to emphasize how wonderful it is that we create our own realities. They're trial realities, they're stories, and we compare them with what happens when we try to follow the predictions of them. I think the ability to feel that you are an agent, that you are able to interact, is extremely important to human beings. And I think I'll leave it at that. It begins the very simple thing, but somehow or other we've been able to create our own universe of discourse, our own stories about where we've come from, where we're going to, and what reality is. There's a very interesting philosophical approach called the philosophy of as if, where the crucial thing is that we build up our own models, and we then, if you're a scientist, you go and you try them out and see if they work. But the same thing applies to social arrangements as well. Let's have a model, let's work on them, and let's see how they work. I think I better stop there. It's a very big issue, I think, especially at the moment. So thank you to everyone.
A lovely coda there to a very stimulating hour. Thank you, Alan. So as always, we have a vote at the end of the hour to pick our topic for the coming month. You might want to jot down that Thursday, July 15th is very likely to be the next time we gather. Again, it's noon Eastern time. You'll have to translate that into wherever time you are. I'll throw out 3 suggestions, take maybe 1 nomination from the floor, and you may vote for as many as you like. I hope you will use that hand-raising function in your in the reactions widget to register your votes. And again, vote for 1, 2, or 3, or 0. If you vote for 0 or 3, you're canceling yourself out. So I recommend voting for 1 or 2 of them. All right, here we go. Topic number 1, extraterrestrial life. What are the prospects for extraterrestrial life? What evidence do we have that it exists or might exist? And how does it connect with recent headlines? That one might be fun to drill down on.
Come on, girl. Sorry.
No, it's all right. Topic number 2, by the way, I'll take votes after I've described all 3. So hang on to your votes for a minute. We'll give everybody the options to compare, and then you can vote. Topic number 2, inequality. How much inequality is a good thing? And when does inequality become dysfunctional or morally or politically problematic? And topic number 3, how does learning work? What is learning biologically, and what do we know about how the process works, and what can we do to improve our capacity to learn? My sister, by the way, wrote a book called How Learning Works. Maybe I'll have her duck in and share a word or two. Okay, those are my 3 topics. I'm happy to take one from the floor if somebody has a topic they think would be of interest to the group. Any volunteers? Looks like y'all are happy to choose among the 3. All right, then let's proceed to the vote. So Alan, hands down, or the check mark down, please. You can use any one of the widgets. Hand raise, thumb up, anything to vote when the time comes. After the vote, please take it back down again so we can get a good count. Sage, as usual, I think will help me count the votes. All those in favor of discussing extraterrestrial life next month, please let us know now. All right, I'm seeing, I think I saw 7 or 8 at one point. Looks like 6 now, 7 now. Okay. All right, hands down, please. Second topic, who would like to discuss inequality? It looks like we have a horse race. I'm seeing that one might have gone up to 9, 8 or 9 there, but I'll let Sage be the official vote counter. Thank you, hands down. And topic number 3, how does learning work? Cormac's voting for that one in analog form. Looks like Vivek is as well. So I think we need to add 2 to the electronic count.
This is the least accountable voting system of all time.
Yeah, this makes it a little tricky for the vote counters, but I want you to know that our voting system has complete integrity, and there has never been a documented case of a fraudulent vote cast in this particular venue. Sage, what are the final tallies? To your best guess, and you're allowed to use your judgment.
It certainly seems to be close between them all. Maybe 9 for inequality and learning versus 8 for extraterrestrial. But I say that hesitantly.
Okay. Well, let's do this. Let's do a runoff real quick. You now can choose between inequality and how learning works. You get 1 vote only. Hands down, please. And if you plan to vote in analog fashion by waving your hand in the window, get it up there high so we don't miss it. Okay, all those in favor of inequality, hands up now. I'm counting 5, 6.
6 on the digital and 1 analog.
Yes, okay, and how learning works. And okay, I think, do we have a winner?
Learning.
All right, learning is our topic for next time. Thank you all. I hope you've enjoyed yourselves, and I hope you'll come back.